In this lesson, we're going to learn how to factor by grouping. Suppose we have a 4-term polynomial like the one you see here, and we want to factor it. How do we accomplish that? Well, we can factor this 4-term polynomial by using a method of factoring known as grouping. So what exactly is grouping and how does it work? Well, let's take a look. In our first example, we want to factor x to the third plus x to the second minus 15x minus 15. I like to factor by grouping by using what I call the grid. The grid is a 2x2 box, and in each of those boxes we will write one of the terms from this polynomial. The first term is x to the third, so in the first box I write x to the third. The second term is x to the second, so in the second box I write plus x to the second. Now I go down. The third term is minus 15x, so I write minus 15x in the third space. The last term is minus 15, and so I write minus 15 in the final box. Now I can begin the process of factoring by grouping. In order to do this, I look at the top two terms and I factor out the greatest common factor. What is the greatest common factor of x to the third and x squared? The greatest common factor is x squared. Now I use multiplication to fill in the numbers around the grid. Here's how it works. X squared times something equals x to the third. X squared times what equals x to the third? Well, x squared times x. So I put an x right up in the top left-hand side. Now we look again to the next spot. X to the second times something equals x to the second. X to the second times what equals x to the second? 1. So I put a plus 1. I now have x plus 1 written across the top of the grid. Now I go down to the second row. Something times x equals negative 15x. What times x equals negative 15x? Well, negative 15 times x, so I put minus 15. And finally, I can check to make sure that things look okay. Negative 15 times 1 should equal what's in the bottom right-hand box, and it does, negative 15. Now I look at what I have written on the outside of the grid. I have x plus 1 written at the top. That's my first factor. I have x squared minus 15 written on the left. That's my second factor. And now I have factored the polynomial completely. When factored, x to the third plus x to the second minus 15x minus 15 can be written as x plus 1 times x squared minus 15. Let's take a look at a second example. We want to factor the polynomial 4x to the third minus 5x to the second plus 100x minus 125. We have a 4-term polynomial, so we can factor by grouping, and I'm going to use the grid. Once again, I write each of the terms in the boxes of the grid. Once I've written the terms in the grid, I look at the top row, and I find the greatest common factor of those two terms, 4x to the third and negative 5x squared. The greatest common factor is simply x squared. Now I use multiplication to fill in the other spots around the grid. X to the second times something equals 4x to the third. X to the second times what is 4x to the third? Well, 4x, so I put a 4x in that position. X to the second times something equals negative 5x squared. X to the second times what equals negative 5x squared? Well, times negative 5. So I put a minus 5 in that position. Now I go down to the second row. Something times 4x equals 100x. What times 4x equals 100x? The number is 25, so I put a 25 in that position. And finally I can check. 25 times negative 5 equals negative 125. That's correct. So it looks like things are going okay so far. Now outside of the grid, I have my factors. I have 4x minus 5 on top. That's my first factor. I have x to the second plus 25 on the left. That's my second factor. And now those are the factors of the polynomial. When I factor 4x to the third minus 5x to the second plus 100x minus 125, the factored form is 4x minus 5 times x squared plus 25. Here's an example for you to try. Can you factor this polynomial completely by using grouping? Please pause the video here and come back when you're ready to compare answers. Let's see how you did. We began by writing each of the terms in the grid. 16x to the third plus 4x squared plus 100x plus 25. Then we look across the top at those two terms and we find the greatest common factor. The greatest common factor of 16x to the third and 4x squared is 4x squared. Now we use multiplication to fill in the other spots around the grid. 4x squared times something is 16x to the third. 4x squared times 4x. 4x squared times something equals 4x squared. 4x squared times 1 equals 4x squared. And now we go to the second row. Some number times 4x equals 100x. What times 4x equals 100x? 25. And finally, we can check. 25 times 1 equals 25. It looks like things are going okay so far. Now we can take each of the factors from the sides of the grid and write those down. That is the factored form of the polynomial. And that's everything you need to know in order to get started using factoring by grouping. Remember, you can learn more about factoring in Mr. Dorey's Algebra Handbook, available at www.doreypublications.com.